welcome to Everybody's New. What is a lovely thing for everyone to do is to say hello in the chat. We've let Haytham give a special welcome because he and I haven't seen each other for about 25 years. But particularly great to have everybody who's here for the first time, and those of you who are on 35 or 6 consecutive meetings, well done to you too. But do say hello in the chat, and then I am going to pass over to my lovely friend James, who has teed this up and has got a couple of wonderful people to get us doing some thinking. So James, I'm going to go on mute. I'm going to keep an eye on the front door, like the sort of security letting people in, and I'll pass over to you. I think we've got the record button on, which is good, so our Kaleidoscope friends can help us with that. But I'm looking forward to sitting back and listening in, and I'll be there with your breakout tech at the key moment. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever people are. We have stretched in the past from the west coast of Canada early in the day to into the next day in New Zealand. So thank you for coming. My name is James Mountford, and I've been part of this little band for a couple of years. And I'm absolutely delighted to have the task, the honour to introduce our two issue holders today, and I'll say a word about them in a minute, but they, I hope, will say more about themselves as well as what kindness means in their institution. Just before that, I think we've ranged quite broadly within healthcare across this extraordinarily deep and important topic. But I think today we've talked about regulation, we've talked about a bit about education. There's more of that in healthcare to come. But I think today is our first foray outside of that home turf for most of us. And we're going into education, you might say, proper. In Britain, we have something called a sixth form, which is what you do between 16 and 18 before you either go off and work or go to college. And my old university pal, James Hanscom, there's two Jameses, is the head of an absolutely fascinating sixth form college called Harris Westminster, which wants to help grow bright youngsters from all over London, and they come to the very centre by Westminster Abbey and have 2 years there. And I went to see James a few months ago and was struck that he had a cushion that said kind on it. So we got talking about that. Turns out kind is one of the institution's values. So James is going to go first, and then we'll go to Ed. If you're a bit older, you can go from Harris to the London Interdisciplinary School, LIS, and that's on the Whitechapel Road. Ed doesn't tell people it's just opposite Poundland, but that's the easiest way to find it. With Ed's directions, I walk past. But it's London and indeed the UK's most innovative, I think, certainly newest university. And Ed will tell us all about that. But they also have, as well as a raison d'etre of tackling problems from multiple perspectives, which God knows we need some of that in our lives today, but they also have kind as a value. So Ed is going to talk after James about how they live that. And then we're going to go into breakouts with a question drawn from the philosopher Taylor Swift and her grandmother. So that's the plan. So we'll have about 5 minutes from each of them, and then we'll go into breakouts. Welcome to everyone who has come in since I started. I'm now going to hand over to James H. With grateful thanks. James, you've gone off my screen, but I know you're here.
James has just sent a WhatsApp, which I'm party to, James M, that he may be in the waiting room still. But I'm very happy to.
Why don't you go first, Ed? Why don't you go first?
Yeah.
So we only were going in age order of the charges at Harris and LIS. So Ed, you go first. Thank you.
It's more exciting to get and go backwards. So I'll carry on. So the London Interdisciplinary School, just to give you 10 seconds on this, is a new university. We're tiny. We opened in 2021. The entire curriculum is one bachelor's degree and one master's, and we're not organized around disciplines. The knowledge is organized around complex problems. So the first term is inequality and you might be learning about network science, you might be learning about history, about neuroscience, and you're doing all of that in relation to the problem of inequality. In term 2, it might be sustainability and material science, data science, and then in term in the following year, you might be looking at AI and ethics and so on. The website, if you look up lis.ac.uk, you can see lots more propaganda there. So, but I'll move on. We do have kindness as a value in our institution, but actually I'm going to talk a little bit more about where we find this hardest to live up to or to deal with. We have a very, very current debate and a difficult debate about kindness to the students and what that means. And there's a bit of a split between people who are optimizing for students' mental health, optimizing to make all accommodations possible. And then there's a kind of another group of people who believe that we need to hold students to account on handing in work on time and standards and so on. And so this is not a new problem for institutions, but it feels quite acute in the moment we're in right now. Even down to things like we've just renamed the student support team, the student success team. I'm going to give a which indicates the direction that I would like it to move in. So I'm going to give an example actually, which is interesting. It's slightly adjacent to the question of kindness, but it's something around rules and holding people to account for rules. And often people bend the rules or allow people to get away with the rules through a sort of feeling that they're being kind about it. I worked with a charity about 10 years ago called Youth at Risk, who worked with really children that were sort of the local authority had lost touch with and couldn't really connect with. And this charity was almost their last resort, and they did a 10-day residential where deliberately this charity threw rules at them. It had a smoking area outside, which had an arbitrarily taped area on the ground. If you stepped out of the area, you had some kind of penalty. You had to be on time for your sessions, otherwise some kind of penalty. You couldn't drink water at your seat when you were listening to these 3-hour sessions. You had to get up and walk to a dedicated area. It was basically designed so that these rules were broken. And then this charity helped the students to account, or these young people to account on those rules. But what you saw was very interesting. It started to organize the group, the mind of this group of young people, and it almost took a pressure away. They're like, oh, okay, I can't break the rules. I don't need to worry about that now. Now, I would love us at LIS to get to that place. I have a deadline. My default is I'm going to make that deadline, and we're going to hold the students to account, or we're going to help the students in their commitment to meet that deadline. We are miles from this at the moment. I actually 10 years later, got that charity to take my entire team through a 2-day workshop. This is one of the least popular things I've ever done, by the way. And as part of it, they introduced this thing around rules to the faculty, to the academics, and to the rest of the team. You had to be back on time. You couldn't eat food during these 3-hour sessions. You had to eat in the breaks, and if you wanted water, you had to go off and walk. They absolutely hated it, and 2 or 3 academics literally refused to do it. They stood up and said, standing up to speak was one of the rules. They stood up and said, I'm just simply not going to do this. I need to eat in a more regular period than every 3 hours. And it was very, very interesting to see that holding when you start to ask people about how they feel about rules, it makes you more empathetic about imposing rules on other people, but it also, I think, starts to make you understand what a profound journey you can go on with this, in terms of taking people on the journey of getting to a new place. And this is the sort of cruel to be kind question, I suppose, is the argument that rages in LIS at the moment, is to what extent are we being too tough, too cruel, or to what extent are we trying to do that in order to be kind, in order to send these young people out into the world ready for the kind of environment that they're going to find themselves in. What does kindness mean? Of course, the part of this debate involves safe spaces. Part of it, if you move along the spectrum, involves deplatforming so that people are not hearing things that upsets them. But I'm talking about something that's been around a little longer, actually, which is holding people to account for the things they've said they're going to do, which is to hand work in on time, and whether it's kind to actually make them do that, especially with about 30 to 40% have named recognised mental health challenges around ADHD and so on. So that's something we're wrestling with. So I'll let you ponder that one, and perhaps hand over to James, who I think I saw arrived whilst I was talking.
You did. Thanks, Ed. James M will just step in really briefly. One of the things that you just made me think of is a discussion we had a little while ago about the extremely unclear, perhaps, and rarely recognised, but I think extremely profound difference between kind and nice. And I kept thinking about that as you were speaking. Kind involving an action intended to help the other. Nice being potentially instrumental and about you. So interesting, kind and rules and young people in a university context. James H, thank you very much for coming along. I'm glad we've finally let you in properly. I've said a few words about Harris Westminster and a word or two about you, but over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I had technical difficulties. I imagine a lot of those are at my end rather than yours. Harris Westminster Sixth Form is a school for bright kids that prioritises students from disadvantage. So we are a school that's all about clever and has some kids with big challenges. And we opened in 2014, and when we opened, our big question was, what does it mean to be all about clever? What does that actually look like? And we had some thoughts before we opened, and then the students arrived, and we had some more thoughts, and we tried to put those together. And we came up in the middle of that year with a definition of scholarship. And we said that scholarship is the pursuit of knowledge that is extensive and exact, and of thinking that is scrupulous and critical. And we have worked on explaining what that means over and over again. One of our big vehicles for this is our school assemblies. We have whole school assemblies at least once a week, and those are opportunities for us to talk about what it means to be at Harris Westminster, what it means to be a scholar, what it means to be on this path. And I remember one of my assemblies from that year trying to explain what extensive and exact meant with the illustration of the States of America, which I have memorized in order of them joining the Union, and the fact that knowing these means that you can then tell the story of America using those facts. So that's where we were and what we started with. And we were never just about learning. We've never been anything near an exam factory, but we were very much focused on the clever bit. But we were focused on the clever bit with an understanding that we were a community, an understanding that we were working together on this pursuit. And in my head, I've always had a piece that C.S. Lewis wrote about friendship. And C.S. Lewis said that friends don't look at each other, they don't gaze into each other's eyes. That's a different kind of love. Friends are alongside each other, following a common pursuit. Whatever that common pursuit may be, that is what they're striving for. And they're there for you. So maybe there's a problem. You need your friend to lend you a quid. I mean, that's fine. Let's get that done with. And then let's get on with the important thing of hiking over this mountain or whatever it may be that you and your friend do. And I've always quite liked that. I think that it's probably a stereotypically male version of friendship, which C.S. Lewis was definitely prone to doing, and I am definitely prone to being. But that was our idea, that we were all about learning. And yeah, there was some stuff, and obviously we'd deal with the stuff. And if you had a problem, we'd definitely be there for you and we'd fix it so we could get back to learning, because learning is what's amazing. And we're all desperately excited about the States of America or whatever it is that it happens to be. And we didn't ignore the idea of those relationships. There are assemblies on kindness from the very beginning, and we had developed some language to name people that we didn't think were terribly kind. And this came out of an assembly that I gave just after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, which happened in our first year. and I was faced with the problem of trying to explain to students how to process what had happened, and to try to make them think that they didn't all have to sign up to wandering around shouting "Je suis Charlie," that there was more to this than that, without giving any kind of suggestion that I approved in any way of the horrible terrorist murderers. And so I invented the word jerks, and jerks is in our school an all-purpose term that can be used by the principal from the pulpit of Westminster Abbey or wherever he happens to be speaking from, in order to describe people who are not kind. But there was this hole in what we were doing, because it's all very well for C.S. Lewis and his mate that went to college together and have known each other for 30 years. But when you're 16 and you're coming into a new school and you don't know anyone and you don't know anything, there isn't that assumption that people are going to look after you. That you can't just assume those friendships. And so we've had to develop language of kindness, and I've been massively assisted in this by a rather brilliant assistant principal that we've appointed. And I think, as a sort of tangent there, it's worth saying that assistant principals in schools are nearly all teachers who've been promoted through the ranks. Kylie, this particular assistant principal, is not a teacher. And very unusually for a massively academic school, she doesn't have a degree. She is wonderfully emotionally intelligent, actually really very clever, come from a tough background in the East Midlands, and is a huge compliment to my way of thinking. And that has helped us develop kindness as a complete counterbalance to scholarship. So very often we talk about kindness and scholarship in the same breath as describing our thing, what we do. And I think that what we're doing is teaching the young people how to behave with each other. And that's an interesting aspect of a school, that it's not just the people I employ, the people I pay, who are being kind to other people. We are in the business of teaching our clients how to be better people. And so that is a key part of what we do. And I think I've talked for way longer than I was allowed to, so I'll stop.
James, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for the things you've chatted in. James, thank you for taking us to C.S. Lewis. I hadn't heard that. I do love that definition of friendship. And I also am dying to meet your assistant principal. She sounds fantastic. I read, I can't remember who this is, but it's somebody prominent in the world of education in general, working in the UK, still alive. And it was just in The Guardian today, which I happened to be reading on a train. And it said that good education teaches people to think for themselves in order that they can act usefully for others. I thought that was rather neat. So look, with those two perspectives, and James, when I'm ever sharing something, I can't look at the screen as well because I can only do one thing at a time, but there were lots of nods and I could see some people taking a note. So I think you hit the spot, as indeed you did, Ed. So many thanks. You did exactly what we wanted you to. We're going to go now into our breakout groups. Bob will mix the decks and bring us back in about 20 minutes. So what we try and do is not run into breakouts so that we can say hello and then come back without having had a chance to get in. This is really a chance with 5 or 6 people in the room that we can all contribute and reflect and probe, take a few risks perhaps. And what happens in the breakouts is whatever happens in the breakouts. We don't go round and hear from them all systematically, but we'll hear a nugget or two from a couple. And then James and Ed, the floor is yours at the end, just for a final reflection. But here's our provocation for you, which perhaps Bob will put into the chat seamlessly. But I promised some Taylor Swift. And it actually is a line from her grandmother, which she turned into a song. So you'll talk about what you want to in your breakouts, but this is our suggestion. So remember, the school is there. You heard the university is there. for the objective of equipping people for life. The hospital, the clinic is there not just to be kind, not just to give people a great place to work, but to heal, to deliver healthcare, to relieve suffering. And so Taylor was talking about this. She said, never be so kind that you forget to be clever, and never be so clever that you forget to be kind. So our question is, for you as individuals, for us in our teams, and perhaps our organizations, or more broadly in our professions, do we think, if we assume that we are on one side of that and we don't get it right, do we tend to be forgetting to be kind enough, or do we tend to forget to be clever enough, and does it matter? Okay. So, Bob, do you want to just give instructions? I will pop that into the chat because I have it almost to hand. And there's thunder behind me in central London. I hope that's not related to anything that we're doing, any judgment on the legitimacy of the conversation.
James, hello. You've done a wonderful job. The thunder, I don't know, is slightly disrupted. I'm just doing a bit of a sort of manual work on the Teams bit. I'm very, very nearly there. So why don't you just give everyone a little reminder in the chat? I reckon I need another 1 minute, and then hopefully these rooms will be ready to cook.
Well, I tell you what, so it's the question's in the chat there, but why don't people chat in, or if anyone wants to unmute and just come in with any thought that was, or a question that James and Ed provoked.
I'll share a quick story if you can hear me okay. Can you hear me, James?
Go for it, Maureen. Go for it.
Yeah, so I was recently visiting a high school similar to the ones that you're describing, where some of the kids had incredible life challenges. And what I loved about one of the things I learned is that on the first day of school, each kid writes a letter to the person in the world who means the most to them. In many cases, it was a grandparent or somebody who was a role model for them. They write a letter, and all these letters were hanging up on the wall in the high school. When the child or the kid would misbehave in a normal high school here in the United States, they would say, go to detention, go away and punish yourself. But here, the teacher walks out with the young person, and they stand in front of the letter and they read it. And I had a young girl come and read her letter. She wrote, "Dear Poppy," that was her grandfather, and what he meant to her. And what the kids were saying is that when they reconnected with their bigger life, when they reconnected with meaning, that it gave them a whole different way to think. And then they would sit down and they would say, what prompted me to behave the way I did? What did I do? And what will I do the next time? And these kids just, I was so inspired by the lessons that they were teaching me about being reflective and caring, even when they had acted out. And I thought it was a wonderful example of how we might mix the two things, the kindness every day in our teachings, and also the technical side.
Lovely. Thank you, Maureen. And Saskia, thank you for what you popped in the chat. We could spend a whole afternoon on that. So I urge people to read Saskia's observation. Bob, tell us how you're doing.
I'm still smiling. The Teams aficionados, I'm smiling at George and the other. There's funny things going on. So for technical aficionados, we've still got last time's rooms, and normally they delete and reset. And what's frustrating is I don't seem to be able to assign people across to new rooms. So we can have a go at going to breakouts, but my hunch is, James, we should probably try and facilitate things as a group. We've got we're not dealing with 120. I reckon we can get into some sort of think, pair, share type stuff. We've got a bunch of educationalists on the call. I mean, we can definitely manage this. I'll keep whirring away in the background, see where I get to. But for the minute, why don't you stay on the main show?
I wonder whether we shouldn't just stick with that. We that has happened before, and I think it worked well. And the magic of being the compere when a hand goes up. So Rachel, come in and give us your observation.
I think it's funny whenever I come on these calls, and I've been coming to them for a long time, and I've not spoke to the whole group before, even though I have thought about it. So it's the first time I put my hand up to talk to everybody. But it's funny how every time I come, the subject seems to resonate with something that's going on at the moment, and it just seems bizarre, always seems to resonate. So I was at a meeting this afternoon, and it was a governance meeting, a really important governance meeting. It's about, keeping our patients safe. And there was talk there about people not having their papers in on time, and actually we don't have the time to go through them thoroughly. The papers are taken as read, but if they're not sent till the afternoon of the meeting, how can they then be read? Are we doing the right thing in terms of our governance? And what you said about, are we being kind, or are we being nice? And actually, is it just because we don't want to face the conflict of saying your papers aren't in on time and that's not good enough? Because actually, I've sat in this meeting and thought, yeah, this is the same people month after month that aren't getting their papers in on time. Should something be happening about that? But it isn't. And is that because we don't want to have difficult conversations, and are we not holding each other to account? These are all very senior people, and this is obviously a very serious, very important subject area. So it's funny how that's kind of what I've sort of taken from this, and I'm thinking I might have a conversation with the chair about, maybe you think you're being kind, but actually we're not, and actually by not telling people or pulling people up on their failings, that's not actually kind, and that's not the right thing to do, but it might feel like the nice thing to do. Do you know what I mean? So that's what's resonated with me from what you were saying.
Rachel, thank you. And probably some of us have worked in environments where people are much better at having perhaps those tough or feel tough conversations almost in the moment. They can be quite difficult at times, but I would say they are a marker of a healthy organization, actually, if it's done with authentic intent for the person and the job. Lots of hands are springing up now. I don't know which of two identical twins, both called Sadler, has got his hand up. So are you Blair or Fred?
So this is Fred. Hi.
Fred,
Thank you for calling on me. Clever isn't a word we use quite as much in America and California as you do in England, but I think we talk about knowing and being on top of our subject, especially those of us in healthcare training, and we talk about the imposter syndrome and not being good enough. So I think there's a tremendous emphasis that a lot of us, particularly some of us older people, went through, where the focus was less on kindness and more on cleverness. And so I'm just thrilled, and one of the great joys of being part of this kindness group has been to see that is discussed openly and how that's done. I think it's related to vulnerability, which a lot of people like Brene Brown and others that are some of my fans have been writing about brilliantly. And I think when I was going through my various layers of school and climbing up the ladder, to show vulnerability was a tendency towards showing weakness. And I wonder if that brilliant comment that distinguished the C.S. Lewis friendships of 30 years, which I love that story. I just recently read it, actually, versus 16-year-olds are just meeting each other. What can that focus be when we first meet? And it could be in medical school later, it could be in residency as well, but I think they need to be balanced, don't you? I think and when we do the vulnerability thing, there may be some people who, to use Bob's story at the beginning, or maybe it was yours, that need to eat more often because of an eating disorder, a gluten sensitivity problem or something. So I'm not sure that some of these rules were that seemed arbitrary for people with maybe ADHD were broadly applicable. So that's kind of a litany of things that came to mind.
Thank you, Fred. And I mean, I bet what we heard from Rachel, you will not have been the only person. In fact, I bet everyone in that boardroom is thinking about the elephant that is unnamed but present and wondering what else is unnamed but present. Thank you very much. Bimby, lovely to see you.
Thank you. Lovely to see you. I have to apologise to Bob because I've joined and rejoined about 5 to 6 times because of the inclement weather. And if I freeze, I do apologise. Maybe just sort of put your hands up and say we can't hear you. I won't be able to see that, of course. But as a surgeon, just sort of thinking about the Taylor Swift quote, I would say that there are times where, as a surgeon, there are times where you have to be clever. Okay, and if you imagine yourself on two ends of a seesaw, you really do have to be clever to get yourself out of a difficult situation, and that does sacrifice an element of kindness at that point. Likewise, of course, there are times where you have to be kind and you have to swing it the other way, and that could sort of fluctuate in the operating theatre setting. But then you have to recognise that there is that dynamic element, in my opinion, where people need you to be clever under certain circumstances, but perhaps more tellingly, they need you to be kind as a bedrock of everything you do, so that you can get away with that collateral when you have to be clever, and that may shave off those elements of kindness. So that's how I see it from that. So that's my first reflection. The second comment, really, and perhaps a question for James, where I heard little snippets when he was talking about teaching and scholarship, is just really in medicine, we sort of often talk about teaching and training, and I just really wanted to hear his thoughts on teaching kindness and training kindness as well, where you actually impart the skills and embed the skills of being kind. So those are just two reflections from me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bibby. Let's give James a moment to gather his thoughts on that, and there's another question from the chat that I'm keen James responds to. So I'll go to Susie and then Charlotte, and then we'll come to JH if we can. Susie.
Hi, thanks so much, Guy. I'm loving this conversation. Couple of reflections on that question, the Taylor Swift's grandma's question. Firstly, I worked for a regulator for a period where there really was a rule that when you went to a meeting, the expectation was that your paper was in, and also that everyone had read it. And that rule worked really well, because I think it was then kinder to the participants in that meeting, because we actually had the chance to discuss the real issue rather than going over the paper. And having been in a national meeting today where I think it was quite unkind how much data was being delivered to people at last minute, it left no time for questions and conversation, and therefore wasn't making the best use of people. I now work for a think tank where we're expected to be very clever. The expectation is everyone thinks we're very, very clever. And it's really important to remind my very, very clever colleagues that we need humanity and kindness in what we're doing too. So this conversation has really helped me think about that, and also helped me make some sense of some meetings I've been at today. So thank you.
Susie, can I just ask you, I mean, I'm really intrigued about those two contrasts in styles. And you said it wasn't very kind to deluge people in data, that they haven't had a chance to read. I mean, I'm also thinking, I'm agreeing, but I'm also thinking it's not very clever either. I mean, no. High-performing teams or boards are not going to behave that way.
No, this was a national meeting. I will remain nameless on the subject or whatever, but it was full of academics, senior leaders, clinicians. A really important subject, and things were being presented. Large volumes of data were being presented on PowerPoint slides that people hadn't seen before, squeezing out any time for conversation, and it was such a wasted opportunity, and I think actually unkind, and unkind in some ways to the people who put the meeting agenda together even. So this conversation tonight has really helped me sort of think about that a bit more, and how I take that into my work and my day job, actually, because I think probably we're unkind sometimes in being too clever.
Brilliant. When my daughter was 11, she tried to do that at a little talk at school, because then she thought she wouldn't be asked questions and she'd rather do the talking than take the questions. But the teacher pulled her up and made her stop. Right. I've got Charlotte and then Jonathan and then Bob, but let's just take a line to James H if we can. And I mean, Ed, of course, by extension, you as well. But there's these two things, and I just saw your chat about the collateral brownie. I love that as well. But how do you build kindness? Let's say deliberatively. And there was the piece above about provoking the internal motivation.
Okay, so the question there is, I mean, they're the same question really. How do you teach kindness? And I mean, my answer is the same as how I teach cleverness. And I think probably how one teaches anything. But I think there are three things. I think that you teach by what you say. And in terms of teaching kindness, that is at least partly through assemblies, but I mean, there are other vehicles for teachers to talk to students. We have PSHE lessons, that stands for some stuff that means life skills, and other conversations. And what you say is important, and we develop our language quite deliberately to be able to talk about that. And I've introduced you to our terms kindness and jerks. What you do is also important. It's important that students see that you have integrity on this. And when it comes to kindness, I think there are two really big ways of showing kindness to students. And one of them is giving them time. So if students got a problem, then sitting down and helping them through it is incredibly valuable. The trouble is that's very expensive. We don't have as much time as we'd like, but one of the joys of being ahead is that there are very few fixed things in my diary, and a lot of things that need to get done but could get done later. And so very often I'm able to say, yes, please do come in. And I say that whenever I can, no matter what I'm working on at the time, and listen and give advice. And sometimes that's not the advice they want, but it is the time. And privacy. So if they screw up, which they do because they're teenagers, and there's no point in being a teenager if you don't get to screw up now and then. They need telling you've screwed up, but to be able to do that when no one else is listening is a big kindness. And finally, what you model. And we talk about idiomatic conversations. It's a source of huge training in staff. And our idiom is that everyone in the building wants to do the right thing, and the students want to be good and sometimes don't know how. And sometimes they get it wrong because they're teenagers again. And so we have to tell them what they need to do, and we expect them to listen to us and take our advice. And sometimes my optimistic, everyone's lovely idiom doesn't always work out, and we need to move on from there. But that is our initial understanding of any conversation, and all the staff try to model that.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, very well said. I'm just slightly, it was hard to follow what you said because I was just so taken, James, with your opening comment about I teach kind the same way I teach clever, which is sort of playing around in my head like a worm. Brilliant. Let us go where we said we would go, which is Charlotte, and then Jonathan, and then Bob.
Good evening, everybody. I hope that what I'm going to say may lead on from that. And I think being an active bystander is really very important in all that we do. And I think sometimes you have to be clever as an active bystander to be kind, to think about how you can intervene to help a situation which otherwise may be going in the wrong direction. So that was just a thought really in terms of intervening to assist in a situation that isn't going well.
Thanks, Charlotte. Jonathan.
Hi, this is my first time here. It was really nice to be with you. I've been involved in medical school education for some years, and I've sort of led courses and been head of year, director of student support, and then most lately I'm chair of the Health and Conduct Committee. So it's all these different ways of relating to students. But I've just been reflecting on what we started off with, and where kindness and rules meet. And I think we can do all these roles with kindness, because ultimately the kindness is about thinking of what's good for that other person ultimately. And so we're not doing them a service if there's no rules, or that we're not helping them to be professional when that's what's needed for their role and for their helping patients in the long term. So we've got to do something. We've got to step in when that's not happening. But it's having that thought of where they're at and understanding them. We can still be kind in the difficult conversations. And so I feel like I can be kind still when I'm having a difficult conversation in a health and conduct scenario, just as I was being kind when I was more in the direct supporting role. So I think there is the place where rules and kindness meet. I don't know. And then just going on to teaching it, there's a school in Leeds that is very much around restorative practice, and I don't know. I went to visit because I was thinking, can this help a medical school? So it's about the culture, and I'm not sure I could summarise it well here, but it's about building healthy communities, listening to the story, not just what's happened, understanding the story. It's a big thing, but I think there's something in that way of working, which has also actually been used in social care in Leeds and safeguarding, that is quite helpful to thinking about how we teach kindness as well. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I mean, there's several things in the chat, I think, that echo what you said about, it needing a bit of savvy and a bit of courage and a bit of, discretionary effort to do something. I think one of the things that we have agreed throughout a number of these conversations is that kindness is an action. Purely a thought is not enough to qualify. Great. Bob.
Thanks so much, James. I have to, it's been quite good actually not having the breakouts, because it's made I've been listening so hard. My brain is about to explode, I think. You talk about a worm. I think there's a sort of few eels going around at pace in my head, and so many wonderful contributions. Thank you so much to everybody for such thought in the chat and out loud. And 3 quick things, James, probably to open up more thought. So one is really picking up on Jonathan and others, this sort of thread about how we do some of these difficult things. Both James and Ed sort of touched on, the conduct conversation. And one of the things that, as you and others know, I've been over the last 2, 3, 4 years taking a harder line on unkind behaviours, and have had some really interesting exploratory conversations with people sort of go, well, isn't that a bit unkind? And you sort of, get into this bit. But I definitely think you can practice and make interventions in ways that are kind and thoughtful, but that does not mean that they are not very, very clear about acceptable behavior on things. So there's something super interesting around that, to think about people's perception of that. Can you have, inverted commas, a difficult conversation in a kind way? Well, of course you can. Lots of us on the call who are clinically trained are trained to have conversations about somebody dying, or who has died, or something incredibly difficult like that, in a kind and compassionate way. So that's an interesting angle that perhaps sometimes gets lays around a bit. The second bit is Maureen's wonderful point in about teaching. And Maureen, if those of you who haven't seen the chat, or made a wonderful comment, which I so agree with, I think, Maureen, our shared passion of teaching around this, in a way, is a little bit selfish, because it makes one feel really good. There's an endorphin piece around teaching, and actually some of the experts we've got in this wonderful community, James, have know and understand the neurophysiology, neurobiology of this better than I do. But there's another bit as well that I think generate some thinking. And certainly personally for me, I've loved teaching around this because it's helped me to reflect at a time when life just feels so busy and one's charging around from one thing to the next. Is the more you teach around this, the more it gives me a little bit of space for self-reflection about my own behavior and the role modeling piece. And I found that very calibrating in a really useful way. And the third bit is a question, James, to think about. So Susie, you triggered this bit off with your lovely bit about, you know, people expect me when I was in a regulator to do this, and people expect me when I'm in a think tank to be clever. And I think there's something super interesting about that. There's some interesting stuff. It cropped up over the summer around gender, around what do people expect, how do people expect me to behave as a man as opposed to you, Susie, as a woman, particularly in the context of kindness. There's some really strong and deep historic pieces. So that amongst a community like this, where people are so thoughtful and so generous, but also prepared to get stuck in with really, you know, deep thoughts, I think that sort of thing, James, might be a very, very interesting thing for us to explore around it. Why should somebody expect the regulator to be, you know, hard-nosed and tough and things like that? Why should we expect our think tank to just be clever? You know, I want a think tank to be curious, Susie, as go forward. But listen, one for us to think about, but really mainly to say thank you to everybody. What a stimulating set of thought. I'm going to have to watch this one again and do some more thinking.
I mean, the last in the chat and in what's been said in the last few minutes has thrown a lot more onto the table. One of our rules, as far as we can do it, is to finish on time. So we've got precisely 11 minutes left. I was going at the end to come back to Ed and James H, but I think now might be a good moment, because I can also ask you here, not just for your reflections, but is there something you would like us to, do you want to pose a question for people to think about for 5 minutes?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have that, but I'll just make one observation which really struck me, which is interesting that you're still, for me, I would imagine surgeons are just the sort of the importance of being clever versus kind versus education, where we do very few things with short-term urgency. I would have thought the clever would completely outweigh the kind. So it's interesting that you still debate that in your line of work. Something we've been discussing at our away day today, which has been triggered now by these kind of comments about the perception of what's kind and what's not, is I've been trying to help people understand that the default of most people is kindness, and that they're receiving it as something other than that, might be for other reasons. And this is, of course, Hanlon's razor, which is a sort of joke version of Occam's razor, which is you should never attribute anything to malice that can be adequately explained by stupidity. But of course, it's not always stupidity that means you're doing something that someone thinks you're doing because of malice. This is such a useful heuristic, I find, where people come to me and they go, they're doing this, they're treading on my turf, that's my job, and they're trying to do, and almost always it can be explained by they've had one too many coffees that morning, or they're just being a bit enthusiastic, or they've been told to do it by someone who doesn't know what they're doing. And actually the sort of receiving something as unkind, I think, is a training, or trying to receive something not as unkind but as something else, is an interesting thing to have a debate at. So training people to be kind is one thing. I'm not sure how you do that. I'm not sure we've had much success with that. I was actually training people today, my staff, to receive something, not necessarily as unkind, but maybe as something else instead. So a slightly different point.
No, thanks, Ed. And linked to that, there was a piece in the chat about distinguishing between the behavior and the person. And of course, our response is governed by all sorts of things that are to do with us as the observer or the receiver, isn't it? Nothing to do with the actor. So Peter, thanks for that point. James H, can we come back to Harris?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that has struck me coming out of both sources of information is this question of democracy and agreeing what the rules are and getting everyone on side. And I think I live in a very different world to you. And one of them is that when I say something, it happens. So we don't need to worry about agreeing a definition of kindness. I say what kindness is, and that's what kindness is. I try very hard to be a benign dictator, but I am definitely a dictator. And that sort of raises the question, why do I care so much about ethos? Why do I work so hard to get them to have intrinsic motivation? And the answer is that you can tell people what to do if what to do is straightforward. You can't tell people what to do if it's complicated. So as part of the cleverness I want to happen, I want really exciting, interesting discussions to be happening in classes with students challenging each other's thoughts, being critical, and then being scrupulous about their own thoughts and thinking really hard about how they know what they know and do they know what they think they know, and not just letting each other get away with saying stuff and going, yeah, I agree, without actually saying, do I agree? Is that right? Are you sure? And you can't do that by dictation. You have to do that by developing an ethos of both kindness and cleverness, or scholarship, as we call it. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Jay. I remember this be about 20 years ago, before anyone had heard of the, I'll say anyone, the surgical checklist, which came about 6 or 7 years later. I was in an operating room in Minneapolis, and I saw something that I will never forget as long as I've got my marbles, which was basically the very senior surgeon who was about to do whatever operation it was doing the checklist, making sure that everyone opened their mouth, making it legitimate to say. And the final thing he said was, if any of you at any point think that something's going wrong, please tell me. And when you look at things like wrong site surgery, it's never that somebody didn't think that something was going wrong. So that's perhaps a high pressure healthcare reflection on what you were just describing, James. Thank you. Look, I wonder, can I just in 2 minutes before we go back to Bob to close us off, can I just ask people, this statement that you made, James, about you teach kind the same way that you teach clever, as if it's as normal as breathing the air. I mean, that struck me as quite, I haven't thought about that before. And am I the only one? Or, because we've often asked here, how do you teach kind? And I think we're quite familiar with trying to teach clever, but I'd never thought about it in quite as crisp a way as that. So was anyone else really struck by that? I'm asking.
I can jump in, James. I think someone else has got their hand up before me. Well, I'll just say something quickly, which is that I suppose cleverness is hard to define, of course, anyway, but it's a mix of kind of nurture and nature, perhaps, or kind of intrinsics and practice. And I suppose in some ways it might, when James said that, what I heard was, yes, kindness, like cleverness, is a mixture of hardware and software. Let's say that's one thing I took from that. Requires work, but it's also, there's a certain kind of genetic starting point. Maybe.
Thanks, Ed. Fred.
Oh, I don't have anything further to add to that.
Thank you very much. Right. So, I mean, I just going to encourage people to just scroll up and down the chat here. Susie put in a very interesting thing about which Susie, might you just expand on that for people who perhaps haven't come across it?
Yeah, so I've just put
about our medical regulator in the UK, the General Medical Council.
So they've proposed new guidance, updating their guidance around good medical practice. It's out now. It becomes active in 2024. There's been quite a reaction to it on social media, because effectively it's almost like putting in a rule that says the expectation is that as a doctor you will be kind towards your patients, and you will be kind towards colleagues. I think it's a subject that would be good to return to on one of these calls, James, because I'd love to hear the range of views that people might have coming from different countries, different professional backgrounds, because I think that's what they're trying to do. They're sort of establishing kindness is one of the rules.
Perhaps we could invite someone along from the GMC to talk about it. There was a piece in the BMJ which was also critical of this and seemed to, I mean, maybe, you know, we are talking semantics, but it's the words that drive the behaviors, but seemed to fall into this trap of assuming that this meant you can't tell people what you see as the truth. You can't, it made it harder to give, yeah, it was the conflation with niceness. Yes. Sebastian, you're an audiologist. I think you work with a lot of children. So in fact, James H's wife is an audiologist as well. So lots of proximity to audiology here. Very good. Right. Look, the time has absolutely flown by, as it usually does. We're at 2 minutes to the hour. So I want to thank everybody, all 40 odd of us here. It's been a sort of mental gym workout. Maybe those of us towards the end of the day, we can have a little lie down before we get going again. But Ed and James H, I really, really appreciate your coming along and sharing a bit of your perspectives with us healthcare bods who should probably get out more.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming in to help us get out. It's been really wonderful, and particularly on an away day, Ed, perhaps. I hope we haven't taken you away from your colleagues. Bob, just over to you to close us out.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. Well, thanks to you for a great bit of facilitation. And, you know, we like to keep the facilitation skills up high by chucking in a few tech changes. And Ed and James H, just massive thanks. It's been lovely to sort of meet you a little bit on email, and what an absolutely wonderful session. And I think if it's okay, we'd love to keep in really good touch. You guys are very, very welcome to come and dip on in to this as and when. I know you have a million things on, and indeed, if anyone else within your networks and communities would like to come and join us, they'd be very, very welcome. So much to think about. Really interesting, the BMJ bit. Susie, thanks so much for doing that. And great, Jonathan, you posted one of the links to Daniel Sokol's bit. There's a really interesting, very well written piece that Margaret McCartney wrote as well, and we'll put those links in. There's some talk that I may feature on a podcast with Margaret McCartney at some point, sort of arguing some of this stuff out. So I feel very empowered by all of you guys. A quick highlight ahead: we're doing a bit of work for October the 19th, not yet quite confirmed. Put a little reach out to the wonderful Steve Svensson, who's agreed to do a session. If it works for his diary, then we'll have Steve in October, but that's to be confirmed. But we've got Amy Edmondson booked up for November, going to be a session around kindness as the tool for psychological safety. Really interesting stuff on that front. I'm penciled, but rather than pen, but Michael West has offered to come and do a session. Susie's given me the thumbs up for December, and we head into the new year with some wonderful friends of this group as well. So I think Sajeev Agrawal, who was on the call a little bit earlier, is going to do a session in January, and other things planned, and we're brewing more. If you would like to run a session, you know somebody who we would love to come and be part of this, please get in touch. I mean, it is our community. It helps hugely if we get these wonderful intros and suggestions. So please do get in touch. We've hit 7 o'clock. With thanks to George and our lovely friends at Kaleidoscope, we'll do a little bit of work around the background. And the wonderful Nikki Macklin, who's actually busy moving house or moving islands, if I've got it right, isn't on the call today. But so a bit of work for George and myself to get a recording up and running. We will do that and get that up on the website. But listen, thanks to everybody for your time. And Ed, James, huge thanks. What a wonderful session. And James M, thanks for facilitating. Catch you all soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.